I am so pleased to introduce Mohit for our first seminar, and it's been a while since I've been able to introduce somebody for an in-person event, not just because of COVID, but because I was on sabbatical the year before, so it's been a while. Mohit did his undergrad at IAT, and then he came to the Robotics Institute at CMU, which is where I got to know him. I was not in the Robotics Institute, I was in CS, but we hung out, all of that crowd was together. And actually back then, both Mohit and I were sort of maybe more on the vision graphics boundary. And I think we both moved away from the graphics side of that a bit and maybe tried to get into robotics because that's where all the cool people are. And I think Mohit has succeeded more than I have, as you'll see today. And after he graduated from the Robotics Institute at CMU, he went to Columbia and did a postdoc, and then has been a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin, where he runs the Vision Lab ever since. Yeah, just so pleased that you could make it and looking forward to what you're going to show us.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me here, and thanks for the very kind introduction. By the way, this is the first in-person talk that I'm giving in about 2 years, so I'm hoping the acoustics through the mask works okay. People hear me okay? Perfect. Thank you. Cool. So I'm going to talk about 3D cameras. But before that, I want to start with a small story about light, right? Now, all of us know that light travels very fast, but we do know, it's common knowledge, that light travels, meaning it has a finite speed. That was not always the case. Till about 400 years ago, people used to think that light just exists instantaneously, right? Meaning it has infinite speed. Galileo was one of the first few people who thought otherwise. He then decided to design an experiment to demonstrate that. What he did was he and an assistant got up on two rooftops, right, each with a lantern in their hands. The idea was that Galileo would turn on his lantern, and then when the assistant sees the light, he would turn on his lantern, and then hopefully Galileo would witness a time delay, right? Now the problem here was that the distance between these two guys was just about 1,000 meters, which would mean that light would take of the order of a few microseconds to travel this distance back and forth, right? And remember, this is 400 years ago, no high-speed stopwatches or anything. These guys were relying purely on human reaction time, which was obviously much slower, right? So they could not ascertain whether light travels. But regardless, this was Galileo's conclusion, right? He still said that I have not been able to conduct this experiment successfully, which means that either light travels instantaneously or maybe it just travels too fast, right? So this is an example of good science. He held a belief which was not very popular. He designed an experiment, he failed, and yet he reported that negative result with possible conclusions. Anyway, so fast forward 200 years, people started believing that light did travel, but still people could not measure how fast it traveled. So there was this very cool experiment designed by this French physicist by the name of Fizeau. He wanted to measure the speed of light. Here was the experiment. He had this light source which sent out short pulses. Then he was an observer. He placed a mirror. This was now farther, about 5 miles apart. And the idea was that he would send out some short light pulses. It would travel to the mirror and come back, and he would try to measure the time delay, right? Now the problem here again was that although this was further, light still took very short amount of time, of the order of 50, 60 microseconds, still no stopwatches. So we could not measure the exact travel time. What did he do? He came up with a really ingenious idea. He put this rotating wheel in the light path. Now the idea here was that when the wheel is rotating slowly, each light beam would travel through this gap and then come back through the same gap, right? So what would the observer see here? Observer would see light pulsing off and on, right? Now the next thing he did was increase the rotation speed of the wheel. And at certain speed, what happens is that a light beam that travels through one of these gaps comes back and hits one of the tooth, right? Which means the light gets blocked. At that particular speed, the observer sees nothing, right? So just using this observation, and by estimating the rotation speed and the number of teeth here, he was able to estimate the speed of light within about 5% accuracy. Now, for me, this is really ingenious, right? He did not have any high-speed timing instruments available. He was able to work around those challenges and come up with this really cool, clever idea. Right? Now, fast forward to present time, we know now how to measure speed of light very accurately, which we can then use to estimate scene distances or scene depths, right? We use this principle called time of flight, and it's a very simple idea. Suppose you have an entity. It could be a physical object, or it could be a wave traveling between 2 points with a fixed velocity v. And suppose you have a stopwatch that measures the total travel time. Then you have this very simple equation that relates the 3 quantities. If you know any 2 of them, you can estimate the third, right? Now, this very simple principle is used in nature quite a lot by animals to detect the locations of prey and predators. In this case, they use sound waves. So this is also called echolocation, right? But the same idea can be used to design cameras as well, which use light, right? And these cameras are, we often call them 3D cameras or depth cameras or distance cameras, because they measure 3D geometry of their surroundings. So here is a simple, maybe the simplest instance of a time of flight based depth camera, right? So it consists of a light source and a sensor. And in the simplest form, the light source will send a very short light pulse into the scene, right? It comes back to the sensor, and there's a high-speed stopwatch that measures the total time delay. And because we know the speed of light, we can estimate the depth using this very simple equation, right? And there's a factor of 2 here because light travels a distance twice back and forth, right? So we need to divide by 2. Now, this very simple principle now, this forms the workhorse of almost all modern 3D cameras. You know, you may have heard of LiDAR, which is used a lot in autonomous cars. The underlying principle is time of flight. In fact, right now, you know, these cameras are driving many new applications. Think about augmented reality, self-driving cars, many different aspects of robotics. Any place where you need to measure the 3D shape of surroundings, it's likely that you're using these kinds of cameras. Right? So it's quite an exciting space to be in. Actually, more recently, these cameras have started making their way into consumer devices as well. As some of you may know, the most recent iPads and iPhones, they have a small LiDAR module built in there, which now you can use for applications like AR, VR. People have started using this to build 3D models of big spaces like this indoor environment here. And it's kind of exciting to see that now these time of flight cameras have evolved to a place where you can start building 3D models like this from essentially a consumer grade device, right? There used to be the point and shoot camera revolution when we started having cameras in smartphones, but now there is almost this time of flight revolution unfolding in front of us because we now have these things in our in consumer devices, right? Now, one thing is, as these applications mature, we are going to have scenarios where we will require higher and higher resolution, right? So think about maybe, for example, an augmented reality setting. In order to get a truly immersive experience, you would need to recover the 3D shape of your surroundings with extremely fine detail. Or maybe imagine a drone which is flying through a forest. It will need to resolve fine structures like twigs and branches to be able to navigate successfully, right? And just to be clear, I want to make a distinction between spatial resolution and depth resolution here. Spatial resolution is just a number of pixels, right? And that continues to rise. But there are more fundamental limits on the depth resolution. So depth resolution is the ability of a camera to differentiate between 2 scene points which are very close, which are very similar depths, right? And that's a very fundamental kind of more fundamental constraint. So just to give an example, let's say you have a consumer grade depth camera, and let's say it's looking at an object about 10 meters away. Despite having very high resolution, in this case about 1 megapixel, this is the kind of 3D shape that you can expect to recover, right? You can maybe tell that it's a human face, but not much more. Now, this is our goal here. This is where you would ideally like to be, where with the same spatial resolution, we want to be able to start maybe even recognizing the person, right? Now, this is challenging because this would require designing these depth cameras which have an order of magnitude higher depth resolution as compared to conventional cameras, right? So, for example, if you are about 10 meters away, instead of having a centimeter resolution, you would need maybe a millimeter resolution. And if that was not challenging enough, we would also like to do that with the constraints of a consumer device, right? Meaning low power, low cost, small size, and low power consumption, right? And we want to do that because we would want these to be broadly accessible, right? We don't want to build a heavy camera which nobody is going to use, right? So yeah, all in all, it's a kind of a challenging thing. We want to achieve an order of magnitude higher performance while respecting some very strong constraints. So this is challenging, but fortunately, there is an imaging modality which is a good fit, which is at least a good starting point, right? And that's what we call continuous wave time of flight imaging. So here is a continuous wave time of flight camera. It kind of looks like the earlier time of flight camera that we saw. It also has a light source and a sensor. The main difference here is that the light source, instead of sending out a single short pulse, it's going to emit light continuously. Just send light all the time, but it is going to modulate the intensity of light over time, right? So for example, maybe the intensity could be modulated as a sinusoid wave over time, something like this, right? So this is a plot of the intensity of light as emitted by the source over time here. So now you can imagine what happens when this light goes to the scene and then comes back. Now let's think about the light that is received by this sensor. So what would it look like? We are emitting this light which varies as a sinusoid. What would it look like when it comes back? Yeah? Stretched or compressed? It's stretched maybe, or it may actually just be shifted, right? Because you're not doing anything to the light wave except just delaying it over time, right? So it's just going to be delayed. And this delay, this shift, what we call the phase shift, that's proportional to the travel distance, right? The longer it travels, the more the shift is going to be. So what we really try to do is measure this phase shift, which is what gives us the depth value, right? Now, how do we measure this shift? Well, there are a few different ways of doing it. One is we can directly just sample this sinusoid. And once I can reconstruct this sinusoid, then I can compare it with the one that I sent out and measure the shift. That will give me the distance. Now, that measuring this directly is kind of an expensive process. So instead, what we do typically is compute the correlation of this received sinusoid with another electronic function. And that electronic function is also a sinusoid, right? So what we do is really just measure the correlation of these two functions. This is done electronically on chip. Eventually, what we measure is just this one single intensity value, which is the correlation of this demodulation function and this incoming sinusoid, right? So it's just one value. Now remember that there is just one value, which is probably not enough for us to measure the phase shift, right? And the reason for that is, if you think about a sinusoid wave, it has three unknowns. There is the phase shift that we're trying to measure. There is the amplitude, how high the sinusoid is, and then there's the DC offset, how high is it shifted vertically. So there is three unknowns, which means that we need to take three measurements at least, three unknowns, three measurements. And the way we do this is by taking three different demodulation functions. And finally, the important thing to remember is that we get these three intensity values from which we can recover these three unknowns, the phase, offset, and amplitude, and the phase then gives us the depth value, right? So this was a very quick primer on how these continuous wave time of flight cameras work. And by the way, these cameras are now used in many consumer devices, including the first generation of Microsoft Kinect, but also more recently the HoloLens device and their Azure device, in case you have played with those. They're all based on this technology. So any questions at this point? Yes?
So is amplitude
That's a great point. Yes, the amplitude is affected only by how reflective your scene point is. Sorry, say that again, please. Uh, so, yeah, so the phase is depends only on the distance. The amplitude depends on how bright your scene point is, and this offset, that depends on whether there is some additional light source in the scene. Let's say there is sunlight or something, that's just going to add a constant amount of light. So you are for this application, you are interested only in the phase. Yes.
Does the offset allow you to filter out like all of the light present, like in this room right now from these lights, or do you use like wavelengths outside the visual spectrum?
That's a great question. In theory, you can measure the offset and filter out everything in post-processing, but there is a price that you pay for doing it in post-processing because of noise. So ideally, what you would like to do as much as possible is to filter it out as much as possible of this optically by using the right wavelengths.
What do they usually look like?
It could look like maybe a spectral bandpass filter, which would let in light of only a particular color. So what you would do is then your camera's light source would emit light only along the selected wavelengths, and the filter will only let those wavelengths through, and everything else is filtered out. Yeah. Cool. Other questions? Yes. Yeah, so the question is, I mean, the way I explained it, it looks like we are illuminating the entire surface, but you can do this analysis on a point-by-point basis. Imagine a single camera pixel. It's going to be looking at a single scene point, and that single scene point receives light from a single source, right? And now this modulation is happening on the intensity of light. So you can send out a single light beam onto that point, and the reflected light is received by this pixel. Now this is if you had a single pixel camera, but if you had a full array, you can do the same thing in parallel for all the scene points. Does that make sense?
At what range?
Oh, at what range? The range is right now determined really just by how powerful your light source is. For example, if you want to build this for an indoor application, then you would have probably a range of 3 to 5 meters maybe. For people have started using this for outdoor application too, maybe 40, 50 meter, even 100 meter range. Right. Yeah. There's another question here.
Is it require lasers or light?
That's a good question. So if you wanted to send a single beam of light, then laser is probably your best bet. But the problem with laser is then you have to do this scanning one point at a time, which is slow, also requires moving parts. So now people have started using what we call flood illumination, where they use something like LEDs or laser diodes, where you don't need expensive lasers. So those LEDs can actually be grown like sensors on chip, so very cheap actually.
Yes, but my point is, it's probably not for, say, lasers, but I thought LEDs are emitting light in different phases at the same time. Is that going to be a problem?
I think that's a very important point actually. And again, the thing to remember here is that what we are modulating here is not the phase, it's really the intensity of light. The intensity of light you can change regardless of what your underlying carrier is. It could be coherent light or incoherent light, doesn't matter. Yeah? All right, cool. So just thinking about these cameras, if you wanted to kind of abstract out the details a little bit, you can think about these cameras as providing a mapping from a depth value to these 3 intensity values that are measured, right? And that's an important point, and I want to illustrate that a bit more. Suppose you have one of these cameras, and it's looking at this particular depth range. And let's say there's a point at a certain distance. Now for this point, the camera is going to measure these 3 intensity values, I1, I2, I3, which are really the samples of the sinusoids at that particular offset, right? Now these 3 intensity values you can think of as a point in a 3-dimensional space, right? It's a 3-dimensional intensity space, which means that now let's say I have a point at a different depth, I'm going to measure a different point in this space. Another point, another depth here, another point here, right? Which in turn means if I look at all possible depths in this range, they're going to map to this 1D set of intensity values here, which is going to trace out this curve. And this curve is what we call the coding curve. This is a very powerful representation. It almost tells us in a geometric way what this camera is doing. And I'll tell you in a minute, what this also lets us do is abstract out all the underlying hardware details and lets us explore the design space of these sensors in this kind of geometrically intuitive space. How? So really, you can think of this curve as defining a mapping, a one-to-one mapping between depth values and the measured intensity values, right? So it's a one-to-one mapping, which means that anytime I measure, the camera measures a point on this curve, intensity values, I can have some kind of decoding algorithm which returns me the depth, right? Let's say the camera measured this intensity point. I can figure out that the depth is probably this one. If the camera measures this, then I can figure out that the depth is this one, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a one-to-one mapping here. And that mapping is purely defined by what were the functions that I sent out, which was the sinusoids. Yeah? Now, this is a highly idealized scenario. We are assuming that there is no noise at all in the measurement, that the measurements are ideal. But in practice, in real life, there is no escaping noise, which would mean that if this were the ideal point, in practice, I would expect to measure anything in this kind of a noise ball centered around the central point, right? I could measure anything, which would mean that when I do the inverse mapping, I could recover any one of these depth values. So there is a depth uncertainty here, right? And this uncertainty could actually be quite large, depending on the noise levels, which is what results in a low depth resolution. So just to emphasize, this is probably the single biggest reason why these depth cameras don't have a very high depth resolution. Their quality is low because of this uncertainty here, right? Now, one way to deal with this uncertainty is to somehow increase the size of this intensity space, right? The idea being that if somehow I was able to enlarge this space, then the same amount of noise here will map to a smaller amount of uncertainty here, meaning higher depth resolution. So that would be nice. So that's nice, but can I do that? Well, not really, because to increase the size of this space, I would either need to increase the brightness of my scene, which I don't have any control over, or I would need to use a brighter light source, which often is constrained by lighting budget or anything, right? So that's something I cannot really do. Right? So I'm kind of constrained to stay within this space, which is provided to me by scene and device constraints. So our main observation here was that, sure, we cannot increase the size of this space, but the reason why we needed to increase the size was to increase the length of this curve. And maybe we can do that by staying within this space just by using a different kind of curve, right? Maybe something like this. Now, this is a longer curve, which could potentially give us all the benefits of the enlarged curve here. Now, as long as this curve may require us to use different kinds of functions here instead of sinusoids, maybe something else. But as long as these functions are physically realizable, right, then maybe we can get all the benefits of long curve, meaning for the same amount of noise, we're going to get lower uncertainty and higher resolution. So that was the key observation here, that just somehow if we can design different kinds of functions which give us different curves, we're going to be okay. In fact, we derived like a simple theoretical expression which related the depth resolution achieved by a time-of-flight camera to this coding curve length. It came out to be a simple linear relationship. Longer the coding curve, the higher the resolution, everything else being the same. This is up to a first order approximation. I'll go into more details later. But this expression was nice because now it kind of gave us a way to analyze and compare many different time-of-flight camera designs onto a single common platform, right? With something like this, you could strip away all the underlying hardware details and really get to the crux of what the camera is doing, right? So let's take a couple of examples. Now, earlier I talked about sinusoid coding, where we send out these sinusoid waves, and that is the preferred method in most consumer cameras today. You use these sinusoid functions. And it turns out that for these sinusoids, the coding curve is actually a circle. I'm not going into the derivation here. And the radius of the circle is given by this expression. It's a square root k by 2 divided by 4. In case the number of measurements, right, remember I said earlier that 3 is the minimum number of measurements. You can always take more. You can take 4, 5, or more to get better performance. But regardless of the number of measurements, you can show that this coding curve will always be a circle if you use sinusoid functions, right? And this is the radius here. From that, you can compute the curve length, just 2 pi r here. Yeah? So now let's look at another method. Now, instead of sinusoids, maybe you can use square waves, right? So it turns out that if you use square waves, then their correlation, you get this piecewise linear triangular kind of functions here. Any guesses what the coding curve would look like here? Any guesses? Sorry? Rectangle is close enough, yeah. And the idea there is that it should be some kind of a piecewise linear kind of curve, right? Hence a rectangle. It is actually a polygon, a hexagon actually in this case. It's a non-planar hexagon. In general, if you take k measurements, then you will get a polygon with sides with 2k sides. But now again, you can do the same thing. You can compute the side length here, and then you can compute the curve length here, like this. And now here comes the interesting thing. Now you can place these side by side, and just by comparing the curve lengths, you can show that, again, at least theoretically, everything else being the same, square coding will always do about 1.8 times better as compared to sinusoid coding, right? So now let's say you are asked to compare 2 different cameras, one using sinusoid codes, the other using square codes. You can predict that the square coding will do better, right? So this was nice. I mean, this was just a way to do analysis. But then we started thinking, can we go beyond analysis? Can we use this geometric tool to start designing new kinds of cameras too, right? Now, one way to do this would be in the space of these functions, which you can imagine can very quickly get unwieldy. Doing optimization in the space of functions is always hard. So instead, what we did was, we said, what about what if we do this optimization in this geometric space of curves, right? The idea being that if we can find a good curve, then we can always go back to the functions that can generate that curve, right? And we already know some desirable properties for this curve. For example, we know that it should be a long curve, right? So let's start designing some curves. So here is the first curve that we thought about. It's more of an educational tool. Now this is a long curve, but this is also self-intersecting, which is not good, because now the mapping from depth to intensity values is not unique. So this won't work, right? So here is another couple of curves that we thought about. This is a helix, and this is like a Hilbert space-filling curve. Now these are nice because these are long curves. These are not self-intersecting. But anybody notice any problems with these curves? Would these work? Yeah?
No, because they're not. I want to say they're not connected at the ends.
So meaning they're not periodic.
Yes.
They're not closed loops. So that's one thing. But the other thing here is that if you notice, there are points on the curve which are close in the Euclidean sense, but they are distant along the curve, which would mean that even a small amount of noise will throw things off quite a bit, right? A small amount of noise in the measurements will give you huge depth errors. So that's not nice. So what you want here is curves which are long, but also distance preserving in some sense, meaning 2 points on the curve, if they're close, then they should be close in the Euclidean sense. And if they're far along the curve, then they should be far in the Euclidean sense too. So that kind of a distance preserving property is what we want. So based on this, we came up with this family of curves which we call Hamiltonian curves. And here is the idea. So we had this intensity space which is like a cube. So what we did was we thought of the corners of the cube as nodes of a graph, and the edges of and the sides of the cube as edges of a graph. And by graph I mean graph as in the computer science sense, a bunch of nodes and edges between them. And then we had this curve which kind of goes along and visits every edge, every vertex of the graph exactly once. So it goes around the cube sides, visiting all the vertices one at a time. For now, just for practical reasons, we exclude the origin and the one directly opposite it. But otherwise, it visits every other vertex. Now let's think about this curve here. It's kind of nice. It's quite long actually. In fact, you can show that the length of this curve increases exponentially as you increase the number of observations. And this also has some nice distance preserving properties in that you can show that if there are 2 points which are close on the curve, they will be close in the Euclidean sense and vice versa, right? Kind of nice properties here. Now, the next question was, yeah, okay, sure, this curve looks nice, but can we actually design functions which create this curve? And it turned out yes. You get these functions now which are not sinusoids, but have this kind of trapezoidal kind of shape. Looks something like this. This is for 3 dimensions, meaning only 3 functions, but you can do this for higher dimensions too. So let's say you have 4 measurements, then you will have a cube which is 4-dimensional, and then you will get functions like this. And if you have 5 measurements, you'll have a 5D cube, and then you get something like this, right? So just a kind of quick aside here, there may be some electrical engineers here, but there is this notion of gray codes in the communication literature, which is really a series of binary codes, and they have this property that any 2 consecutive codes differ only in 1 bit, right? So if you look at these 2 codes, they differ only in 1 bit here, these 2 codes, they differ in 1 bit here, and so on. And these codes are used a lot in communication, digital communication, electronics, many other applications, because they are robust to noise, because of this 1-bit property. And one way to create these gray codes is actually you start with a hypercube, and you assign some codes to every vertex. So this guy gets 0, 0, 0, this guy gets 0, 0, 1, etc., etc. And then you visit these vertices along a Hamiltonian cycle. So you start from here, that's the first code, go to the neighboring one, you get this code, and so on, right? So essentially, the way you create these codes is by traversing a Hamiltonian cycle on this kind of a cube. Now, this is very similar to what we just did, actually, right? The only difference is that in gray codes, we only keep the vertices of the cube, whereas here, in Hamiltonian codes, these are more continuous. So in a way, you can think of these Hamiltonian codes as continuous versions of these binary gray codes. So they inherit all the nice properties. Anyway, so going back, earlier we were talking about coding curve lengths, right? And we said how longer curves are better. So here is just a quick plot to show x-axis is the number of measurements, and y-axis is the coding curve length. So with sinusoid and square coding, the coding curve length increases, but very slowly as a factor of square root k, whereas here it's more exponential. So at least in theory, you can get much higher precision with something like this, right? So I want to quickly show some simulation results. So we simulated this via computer simulations, simulated sensors and everything. And this was the first scene that we looked at. I already showed some of this. So here we are trying to simulate a scenario where sensor is looking maybe at something 10 meters away. And this is the kind of results that we get. Again, with sign coding, we do start getting the overall shape. And the other interesting thing here to notice is that square coding does actually a bit better than sign coding, which is as predicted by our analysis. But then these Hamiltonian coding, it does, in this case at least, about an order of magnitude better, which is what we set out to do earlier, right? Again, this is everything else being the same number of measurements, the same power, same everything, by changing the functions. Here's another scenario. We're trying to simulate more like a long distance 3D modeling kind of setting. This is a quick side-by-side comparison, sinusoid versus Hamiltonian. Even sinusoid coding does recover the overall 3D geometry here, but if you zoom in, you will see that this here gets very fine level details, individual bricks here. Here's another, maybe closer to robotic scenario. Here's like a staircase, and let's say there's a 3D camera looking at that staircase. This is a ground truth shape, just one vertical scan line. Now, this is what you would get with sine and square coding. And just to kind of illustrate the point, we did this in very strong noise. So because of which these conventional schemes, they recover very noisy shape. The underlying structure is completely lost. But with Hamiltonian, we get something like this here. So this could, you can imagine, make a qualitative difference between a robot successfully climbing a staircase or falling down. So this was all fine in theory, but the one problem was we now wanted to take the next step and demonstrate this thing on real hardware. But all the consumer scale off-the-shelf devices that we had were limited to only these sinusoid codes, so we could not really implement on those. So what we did was we built our own 3D camera. In this case, it looked like this to start with. There's a laser diode here. And there's a bunch of mirrors and lenses, and eventually goes back into this 1 pixel. Because it's 1 pixel only, we had this mirror which scanned over the scene. There's a bunch of other stuff too here. But right now we are in the process of miniaturizing this on a chip. So hopefully this will be more compact in the future. But this was just a quick scene. Again, this staircase kind of scene that I saw earlier at a smaller scale now in lab. So this is what we get with this sine coding, and this is what we could get with the Hamiltonian coding. Again, the structure is better preserved here. It looks like a staircase. So here was another example of a mannequin object. So this is still very research grade, very much in the lab. But again, we are hoping that we can demonstrate this on small devices. But yeah, so I want to emphasize here that these designs that I just talked about, these are by no means optimal. It could be possible. It is, I'm sure, possible to do much better. But what we really wanted to do here was provide almost like a geometric way to think about this problem, which can then be used to come up with even better designs in the future. Now, these better designs could be either small perturbations of these Hamiltonian codes, or they could be something completely different. I don't know at this point. But if you have any ideas, I'll be very curious to talk with you. So, any questions so far about this part? Yes.
So you mentioned earlier in the lecture that the laser diode was slow and expensive, and there are technologies using a flood light source.
Mm-hmm.
Are they still in development? I was just wondering if you saw a possibility of making more design to a flood light source.
So the only reason why we had to go with this single pixel device, the laser beam design here, was because the sensor that we had was only 1 pixel. So there was no reason to do flood illumination. But if you had like a full array of these things, then you would go with flood illumination. So this is compatible with flood illumination. Yeah.
Is it more a software upgrade, or it requires some hardware to do the new curve?
You would need to change your light source so it can emit these kinds of functions. So you would need to do some minor hardware modifications, which can be done in software in some sense, or firmware maybe, but at least some interfacing with hardware is needed. Yes?
Is it possible you could implement a sinusoidal curve following the Hamiltonian curve that you already presented?
So you have a sinusoid curve followed by Hamiltonian?
So going through the binary points that you dictated the coordinates of the region, you have a sinusoid connecting those points instead of straight lines.
So that would actually look something like this here actually,
Right.
where instead of connecting them via straight lines, you connect them via curves. Now, the nice thing with this is that this curve is actually long, even longer, right? You can imagine. But what you lose out here is stuff at the corner, because now here there are points which are getting too close to each other. And that's something you want to avoid. Now, there may be some applications where it's okay to have these points close by. Then yes, this will actually do better. Yeah, good point. Yeah, other questions? Yes. This one? Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, exactly. No, that's a great point actually, and we have been thinking about this as an optimization problem for quite some time. And really the challenge here is to come up with the right optimization objective. Now, length is only one objective, but as we can see, that's not the only thing. So because of that, we have also been thinking about imposing some kind of what we call distance preservingness. So for example, this curve is not good, because as I said, if you could take points on this curve, which are close in the Euclidean sense, but far along the curve. So, and people have actually in the pure math community looked at this problem. There is this thing called the rope problem, where they have a rope of a certain thickness, and they want to pack in as much of it as possible into a box. So essentially what you want to do is really make this thing thicker while keeping it as long as possible and fitting it into a volume. So we have been thinking about this. I mean, I think there is a way to do it formally. We haven't been able to get to it as yet, but there is scope, I'm sure. Yeah, great question. Yes?
Your right-hand side, the performance curve or whatever, would there be a constraint on how small your radius could be, if that makes sense? Like, if they
Yeah.
get close together, you have an issue?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, this kind of ties back to the previous question. You don't want the radius to be too small, because then things will start getting conflated with each other. So what you want to place is almost like a constraint here on the thickness of this curve, which would constrain the radius, right? Now the thickness of this curve will be determined by how noisy do you expect your measurements to be. If you are in a scenario where you're confident that you won't get too much noise, then you can actually make these very thin and small and pack in more. But yeah, so that's a trade-off. Yeah. Yeah. Impact the time it takes to, sorry? Oh, that's a great question. So the length itself does not determine it the length doesn't influence the decoding time that much. It's just that some of these codes will have nice analytical expressions, and some of these won't. So anytime you have a function which has an analytical expression, it'll be easier to decode. Otherwise, you have to resort to some kind of a search-based mechanism, which will be more expensive. But it's doable, just more expensive.
I suppose whether you like it or not, you're collecting Doppler data about the speed of the objects in the scene. Like, my initial instinct is that it would just come up as noise and it wouldn't really help very much, but do you think there's any future in using that data for good, or is it just too expensive to process?
No, that's a great point. Again, it really depends on how fast your objects are moving. And if they're moving relatively slowly, with respect to how fast you're modulating light, then you won't be able to get anything. So either you look at fast-moving objects, or you start modulating your source fast enough. Because if you can do that, if you can get your modulation to comparable speeds to the motion of the objects, then actually you can get some very useful information out. Yeah.
I'm wondering why Connect or other consumer devices haven't implemented something like this, or how would it be for them to apply?
That's a great question. I would like to talk to Microsoft about that too. Actually, we have been kind of in touch with some people over there. This is still very new, very research grade, and this is still very theoretical actually, because anytime you start putting this on a real device, you will have to start incorporating real device constraints. So in one follow-up work that we did here, we started thinking about this optimization problem again, but in a constraint setting. So now let's say we have a device which has some more additional constraints, how would you incorporate that? So that's something we are actively looking at actually. All right, so how are we doing on time? We have maybe 10 more minutes? 10 minutes? So if so, maybe I would like to talk a little bit about another thread that we are thinking about. So far this was kind of a very more of a theoretical study about how these cameras work, what could be optimal designs. But now another thing that's been happening is as these cameras become more mature, they are starting to step outside the laboratory in the real world where they face a lot of real challenges, right? So one thing that we have been working on for quite some time now is to design cameras that can work reliably in the wild. And by in the wild, I mean in every environment. The same camera should be able to work in bright sunlight, in bad weather, but also for every scene. It should work regardless of the geometric complexity of the scene. It should work just as well in a cave, and it should also work just as well if you have a material which is uncooperative, right? For example, if you're dealing with glass or metal, traditionally difficult objects, they should just be able to work. So for example, if you think about ambient light, I mean, this is very important, of course. You want to have cameras which can work outdoors in bright sunlight. So here is an example. This was just we put together in the lab. So here we have this object here, and we are looking at it with the camera, and we are illuminating it with a projector, one of these things. And in this case, the projector was projecting some kind of a barcode like pattern, right? So something like this here. Now the other thing we did was we captured these images more like a time lapse over the course of a day. So starting at 6 in the morning, when not very bright sunlight, you can clearly see these stripes here, right? But as the day progresses, there is more and more sunlight. By noon time, we are barely able to register any stripes here. And this is the same problem that these time-of-flight cameras have to contend with too, because eventually they have a light source, which or could be a laser, could be an LED, but it needs to compete with sunlight. And sunlight is often orders of magnitude brighter, so it doesn't really work, right? And you can see the problem here. I mean, if your light source is not even visible, you're not going to be able to extract any useful information. So it turned out that some of these ideas that I just talked about, this Hamiltonian coding, etc., you could either use this to get higher depth precision, but you could also use the same ideas to get more resilience to ambient light, to sunlight. And I'm kind of skipping the details, but I just want to show a quick result. Here is how the 3D quality degrades over time if you use these conventional sine codes. So you see that it starts off reasonably well, but over time you kind of start losing all the structure, right? But with these Hamiltonian codes, you get something like this. That it does get more noisy, of course, as you would expect, but it still retains the underlying shape. So something like this could be promising for outdoor sunlight operation. Now another thing that's starting to come up is, as again these cameras become more and more popular, you can imagine scenarios where there'll be multiple such cameras in the same space, right? Imagine, as I said, these cameras are now in cell phones. They'll probably be more common in autonomous cars, robot navigation. Again, multiple Roombas may be zooming around. So what will happen here is, again, if you just have one of these cameras, it's kind of nice. You send out this light, the camera receives that light. Let's say it's a sinusoid. We measure the phase shift and we get the depth. But again, the problem is there is another camera with its own light source. Now the challenge here is that this sensor is going to receive light not just from its own source, but also from this interfering camera. So what the camera measures is kind of the summation of these two things, which will also be a sinusoid, but a different phase now, and you will get completely incorrect depths. So here's an example. This is a scene in the lab. So this is the depth map without interference. And this is when there is interference with only two cameras actually. And you see big errors here, both in terms of noise, but also very systematic errors too, which are hard to deal with in post-processing. So we started thinking about this problem, and then the first thought was, well, this is the kind of problem that wireless communication people must deal with all the time, We are just complaining about 2 cameras. They have billions of devices. They must deal with interference. And sure enough, yes, there's a lot of very successful techniques there. For example, one is what we call TDMA, time division multiple access. The idea there is that if you have multiple users, we're just going to divide the total time into slots and then assign non-overlapping slots to individual users. So we kind of just trivially prevent any clashes here by assigning different slots. So this sounds promising. The only challenge here is that we can't do this in wireless communication because there is a central authority that does this arbitration. But in this time-of-flight camera, especially imaging in the wild kind of scenario, we cannot expect to have a central authority like this, right? Imagine multiple iPhone users maybe trying to scan like a museum artifact. You cannot expect to have that kind of close coordination. So what we did was we came up with a stochastic version of this approach, where we still have these time slots, but now instead of having this deterministic access, we assign these slots probabilistically, meaning in each slot, each user will send out light with a certain probability. And it turns out that if you do this randomly, then it's quite effective actually at preventing these collisions. Now, the key thing here is that we have to choose the probability the choice of this probability is very important, because if the probability is too small, then nobody will send any light, and if it's too large, then there will be too many clashes. So it turned out that there was this sweet spot in the middle. There is this optimal probability that we could figure out, and with something like that, we could get better results. So this is just a quick picture of the hardware here. This is in the lab. Each of these is a Texas Instruments time-of-flight camera. Here we had one primary camera, let's say, and the other 3 are interfering cameras. And this was a scene that we set up. Here is the ground truth depth. Here is what we get with interference. And there's a big difference here. But with this simple stochastic approach, we could get something like this. So kind of closer. Now, here we are talking about a camera getting multiple returns from different cameras. But you could be in a scenario where even if there is only one camera, you could still get multiple returns. How? So let's say you have this very simple scene, just a single flat wall. Here, light source sends light, comes back here. There's a single sinusoid. But now we make the scene more interesting, something like this. Now, even with a single camera, there will be multiple light paths, right? This light path goes back in, goes here, comes back, another light path, and so on and so forth. So now, despite just having a single camera, now we have multiple light paths, each kind of adding up, and each creating the same effect as before, where now you are going to get incorrect depths here. And this is, by the way, a very classical problem in computer vision. It's called the interreflections problem or multi-path problem. And there have been many approaches which kind of assume a small number of these indirect paths. But in practice, you can imagine a robot maybe in a cave. There could be an infinite number of such light paths. So that's a problem. So our observation here again was more of an intuition actually, was that if I could somehow ensure that all these interfering paths, they somehow add up to a DC, just a constant value, somehow, and right now I'm not saying how, but if somehow we can ensure that, then what will happen is that yes, it will still add up to the true reflection, but it won't really change the phase. We're still going to get the correct depth value. So that was the key idea. Again, I'm skipping the details here, but based on this, we came up with a method. And I'm going to show first the simulation result. This is in a room. Interreflections. So this is the ground truth shape. This is what happens if you don't deal with these interreflections. Depths are overestimated. So imagine there is a Roomba. It will kind of keep bumping into the walls with something like this. But with this approach, we could get a more correct shape here because we were able to deal with these interreflections. Here's another example in the lab where I put this together. There's a shower curtain here, and there's a surface behind that curtain. And the goal here was actually we wanted to recover the 3D shape of the shower curtain, right? And this is challenging because some light will hit the shower curtain and come back, but most of it will actually go through. hit this opaque background, and then come out, right? Now, this kind of a scenario happens often in medical imaging, where there is a transparent or translucent structure, and behind that there is an opaque structure like bone, right? So here is what happens because of interreflections. You get a lot of errors and holes, but with some of these approaches, we could get something like this. We could even recover the shape of the folds in the curtain, which was kind of nice here at this point, right? So as I said, a lot of this was done in the lab, but fortunately, some of this work actually saw the light of the day, in that it was picked up by a large company in the industrial inspection space. So the company is Omron. Some of you may have heard of it. It's a large company. They build a lot of industrial inspection manufacturing robotics tools. So they built a product around this, which was designed to do inspection on printed circuit boards. So they just released this product last year, which is kind of encouraging. And from what we have heard, it's kind of doing very well. So here is, you can see this thing, it's kind of projecting light in small spaces. And then based on that, the goal is to recover the 3D geometry of these chips for doing any kind of defect inspection. So here is the chip here, and here's the 3D shape. And this is a very, very challenging problem, because you see all kinds of concavities here, so there is multiple reflections. These things are made of metal, glass, very, very challenging. Now, some people call industrial vision like the underworld of computer vision, because you don't really get to see it in action. This is very far from consumers, but it's a huge multi-billion-dollar market. Very important problems here. So yeah, some people are also considering this for applications in surveillance and navigation. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, I kind of want to end on a slightly philosophical note, which is, you can think of these time-of-flight camera as active cameras, because they don't just passively observe the scene. They actually actively probe the scene by sending in some kind of coded light. And the idea is that by probing the scene more, by asking some questions from the scene, you can recover more information, right? So as Heisenberg, this is the physicist, by the way, not the chemistry teacher. Not many people watch Breaking Bad here. So he said, what we observe is not nature itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning, right? And these cameras really interact with nature by asking these visual questions, right? So I really believe that if we design cameras which ask the right kind of questions, we can build cool robotic systems, computer vision systems, but also see the world around us in new light. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have time for questions. There were a lot during the talk, but if you have more, we have time.
Yes.
So what sort of goes into making a decision about the dimensionality of the image space, or the intensity space?
So there's many practical considerations. For example, if these measurements are taken sequentially, then you will be constrained by how fast your scene is moving, right? Because right now we are assuming that all these measurements are taken at the same time, right? So if you have a scene which is moving rapidly, you cannot probably take 10 sequential measurements, because by then the scene would have moved. Now, there are ways to take some of these measurements in parallel. Then you can take more. But those are the practical constraints. So just as an example, if you think about the new Microsoft, the HoloLens device, I think it takes anywhere between 5 to 9 different measurements. So that's the space that they are looking in.
All right. Any other questions for Mohit?
Do you foresee a world where there are more Tesla fatalities on sunny days?
You mean more or less?
More.
More. Well, it's more of a political question, actually. But I think that these cameras, this technology can make things safer. Now, I think the challenge here is to make them cheap enough to be commercially viable. But I sincerely hope, as I was talking with Seth earlier, I think in the next 5 years, we'll see a new family of these devices which will be about the same ballpark in cost as your regular cameras, then I think at that point it will be a no-brainer to use them.
And Teslas will kill you. It's just a matter of time.
There's a question, yeah.
For increasing dimensionality, is that more about processing power or storage or both?
It's both, as I was saying. So there were some practical constraints about motion, but yes, the other constraint is you are capturing more data. So you need to be able to capture that data, store that data, and process that data fast enough. So that you also pay computational cost. Yeah.
So for the stochastic way of reducing interference, how does that affect your sort of temporal resolution?
That's a great point. So yes, you do lose temporal resolution because for a low enough probability, there are several slots that are going to be left unused. So that's the price that you pay. But the hope is that if you have an acquisition time which is long enough, you can divide it finally into smaller slots and still achieve the right interference mitigation without sacrificing temporal resolution too much. But
So would you say, would it still be applicable to things that require high speed or consistent frame rates? Or is that a separate sort of space?
it will in theory. Again, eventually, the number of slots also depends on how many interfering cameras do you have. So let's say you're in a scenario where there's 5 interfering cameras, then maybe we can deal with it right now. But if you have 100 interfering cameras, let's say, then this approach may not be the best way to deal with it.
All right. I'm going to stop there because we've run late because there was a lot of engagement, which is so delightful. This is my first seminar in like a year and a half, and I'm delighted that you all are here and that we had an actual speaker. So thanks for coming. There's lunch, and the lunch is out there. The easiest way to get to that lunch would be to go out that door. But if you're over there and you go out that door and go really fast, you'll probably be first. Let's thank the speaker again, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.